It's time for FNPS After Hours.
FNPS After Hours.
FNPS After Hours.
FNPS After Hours.
Thanks for joining us for tonight's edition of After Hours.
FNPS After Hours.
All right, welcome everybody to our June After Hours. We're squeezing it in right under the buzzer. Right? Is that the right term? I don't know. I'm not really a great sports person, but I'm really pleased to be here with all of us Andersons. So Lilly Anderson-Messec on the left is our Director of North Florida Programs and Terrae Keepers Coordinator. And then Dr. Loran Anderson is a professor at FSU. Retired professor at FSU. And very awesome person who has agreed to come back. We had a lunch and learn with him on Friday, and we had a lot of questions. And so I thought we'd let Dr. Anderson just talk about whatever he wanted to talk about, and everybody could ask him questions.
Why don't you introduce yourself again real quick?
Okay, I'm Loran Anderson. I'm Professor Emeritus. Been in Florida since 1974, so I've lived here longer than everywhere else put together, but I did teach at Michigan State for a year while the professor there was on sabbatical, then several years at Kansas State University, then came down to Florida State University, which has been a nice place to study botany because the Florida Panhandle is really unique. Yeah. I was telling Lilly that a lot of my research has been done with anatomy, the internal structure of plants to help decide plant relationships and taxonomy. And as you accumulate knowledge, then you become perhaps available for peripheral activities. And forensics is an interesting thing. Forensic refers to public information, just like Latin, the forum was the area for government and political information in ancient Rome. So forensic science is the sharing of science for public information. It's often related to legal terms, but it's sort of a natural spinoff. For example, back at Kansas State University, I had a person contact me that had a meat processing plant, and he'd love to have smoked meats, and he had an opportunity to buy a huge amount of hickory, but it wasn't hickory sticks, it was sawdust, and he had no idea if it was hickory or not, so he asked me for some help. So I pruned some hickory trees on campus and processed them to dissociate the cells so I could look at the cells under the microscope, and then looked at the sawdust. And I could tell him, yes, there's hickory in here, but there's something else. There's a filler, so you need to decide if it's good enough for smoking meats. So that was an interesting little application. Since then, I've had various applications using wood anatomy. One that lasted a lot longer and more intensely than I thought I would, involved and dealt with cannabis. A fellow student that got his PhD about the same time I did was involved with a court case with cannabis with a very rich client in New York. So the client's parents sent him and Professor Schultes, a very renowned botanist at Harvard, to Afghanistan to look at cannabis indica and to see if it was different from cannabis sativa, because the federal law says that marijuana is cannabis sativa. So they were looking at a possible legal loophole, like prove it's cannabis sativa, it might be cannabis indica. Well, my friend took pickled material and actually pickled stems and leaves and such in Afghanistan, and asked me to look at it and compare it with cannabis sativa. And I was at Kansas State at the time and put it on the shelf thinking, why should I look at that? Why did he get to Afghanistan? Did the mafia send him or what? But curiosity got the better of me. And so just outside of Manhattan, Kansas, where Kansas State is Fort Riley, and the rolling hills of Fort Riley have lots of cannabis still growing freely from the days when it was raised a lot for fiber. In World War II, they needed a lot of rope, so it was still there. So I pickled some tissues of cannabis sativa and compared the two and found that they were rather distinctive in their wood anatomy. And so I was involved in numerous court cases where they would present the what we call the species question. Is that green pile of tissue on the evidence stand really cannabis sativa? It might be cannabis indica, which is outside the law technically, but then judges would often instruct the jury, well, this has all been very interesting information that scientists have given us, but you're to disregard it all. That a rose is a rose and marijuana is marijuana, so forget all that. But a few cases were thrown out because they couldn't prove that it was cannabis sativa as opposed to cannabis indica. So I wasn't terribly happy with that, but I figured it was a start. But it took me several years when I got the state of Florida to change their law to say that marijuana is any species of the genus cannabis, because that closes a loophole. But it was very interesting. For several years, I had been all over the country and the Bahamas and England and Canada to testify in court about the differences between cannabis indica and cannabis sativa. And then in Florida, we had some very interesting cases. One of the more interesting ones, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement brought me a little baggie that had some material in it and said, I want you to look at this and tell us what you can tell us. We won't give you any more information other than it came from the throat of a deceased person. And so I made some microscope slides of the debris that was in that bag and found oak pollen and pine pollen, and interestingly a desmid, which is a unicellular alga in the genus Clostridium, sort of boomerang shaped alga. So I said, well, if he died because of this, he was drowned in water, because that's where the alga would be. And the evidence was given me in midsummer. I says, well, the pine pollen and the oak pollen are spring, so the only place you'd find them in the summertime would be in literally a sink, because they fall into the water. And so I said he was probably in a pond and drowned. Turns out that pollen structure, the wall is so durable that they're actually use pollen in exploration for petroleum. They'll take cores of earth from various strata and determine what spores and pollen grains are there to suggest that it was a oil-rich or oil-poor stratum. So they're very, very durable. So they were there. And then after I told them that he drowned, they gave me debris from the suspect's belt loops and the shoestrings of his sneakers. And I looked at that and found exactly the same thing: pine pollen, oak pollen, and that desmid Clostridium. There was one little piece of material that was larger, and I said, well, this is a rhizome of some kind of grass or sedge, but I can't tell from just that little bit what it is. So when they took me out to the site, which is in northern Lyon County, where the fellow met his fate, and sure enough, the dominant grass there was Panicum hematomum, the maiden cane, and its root structure was just perfect to that little fragment that I saw. So this was all circumstantial evidence, but the same species were in the victim's throat as on the clothing of the suspect. some other evidence was a little bit stronger than circumstantial. He was arrested driving the victim's vehicle, which was a nice new vehicle. So they surmised that they had been chatting over a beer at the bar. And so the suspect took him out to a good fishing place and drowned him to take his vehicle. But the forensic botany there certainly tied them both into the same type of setting. Then I had a case in that was interesting in a different way. A fellow was accused of shooting another fellow as they were leaving his property. They had been fishing and had too many drinks, I guess, and he told them to leave his property and apparently fired his rifle. And he claimed he fired in the air, and his in argument, he said that it broke a branch of a dogwood tree. So they asked me to look at it 3 days after the fact. And I thought, well, what can you do 3 days after? Well, and I looked at it, and the branch is only partially broken and hanging, and the leaves were wilted. So I took 20 leaves from the wilted branch and put them in a baggie, and 20 leaves from a healthy branch, and weighed them each, and then went back. And then I sawed into another branch to artificially break it similarly to the original break, and took leaves from it every day. And on the third day, the weight of the wilted leaves matched perfectly with that of the original. Then further, they had some chemists look at the wood of the actual fracture, and it had a high amount of copper in it, which is the casing of a round. So it was again circumstantial, but yeah, he had fired a shot that had damaged that dogwood. The unusual thing that was flying the ointment was they fired more than one shot, so we don't know what happened with the others, but it was interesting. Then very recently I had a litigant down at Cape San Blas that he had property that he was claiming the next door neighbor had damaged the vegetation on his property. So he's suing his neighbor. His neighbor had just barely built a very nice, beautiful new vacation home, and this guy hadn't built anything, but he figured, rich neighbor, I'll sue him. So they had me go down and look at the property. And fortunately, just across the dirt road from his property was part of the state parks real estate. So I could compare relatively pristine coastal vegetation and compare it to his property, and the species were basically the same. He didn't have any real damage on his property, but he thought he could get some money out of his neighbor. There were a few other cases, but those are some of the highlights that were interesting. So forensics can be just a natural spin-off of learning a lot about plants. One thing I didn't mention, which has been mentioned too often anyway, is the Bundy case. I did some forensic work in the Bundy case, identified the wood that he used to bludgeon the Kalamazoo girls. Were able to get fragments out of their scalp, and I made a slide, and it was just a few cells holding together, but the structure of those cells was such that I could say, hey, that's a species of the white oak group. We have two major groups of oaks, the white oaks and the red oaks. The white oaks have sweet acorns that mature in 1 year, and the red oaks have more bitter acorns that mature in 2 years. But the white oaks have cells that we call parenchyma within the wood that grow into the vessels, which are the larger tubes for moving water. And this sort of blocks the vessels. And that was so characteristic because there were a couple vessels in that little fragment. So I was able to identify the wood that had been used. And then with the young girl that was kidnapped after school over in the Live Oak area, Bundy apparently had taken a van. It turned out to be a biology department van from campus, and went over there and used the van to kidnap this girl. And so they had some foliage on the underside of the van. They asked me to identify because they had been searching for the girl for a few days and hadn't found her. So looking at the species that were stuck to the van, I could tell them to stay away from cultural baited areas and drier areas and look to the thickets and more moist areas. And very shortly after that, they found the girl's body. So I was involved in the Bundy case in a minor way. And then when Kimberly Leach was the girl, but then later on, Casey Anthony had a big case in Florida, and one of my colleagues did the botanical study there, and this, what's her name, Grace, this TV personality that I think she's a hotshot attorney, contacted me to comment on the studies, and I agreed with the forensic work that was done there, that the body had been in that site for quite some time, making some plants had grown up through the skull that wouldn't have happened if it had been recently placed there, because they had suggested that a coyote or something had moved the body over there, but it was as the forensic botanist said it was. So that's an interesting little sidelight to just accumulating information about plant identification, is you can sometimes use this in legal circles to help clarify questions that the attorneys might have about a given case.
Yeah. Do you remember what your first case was and how you got into it? And was it contract type work that you did?
Well, the cases where I actually got a little bit of remuneration, I was contacted by the Florida Department of their legal department, their lab, asking me, can I help? And so then I did that work. But some of the cases that weren't courtroom cases, like identifying the sawdust, I was just contacted by an individual who wanted some help, and so I provided the information that they wanted. But the cases in Florida were all dealt with via an attorney or a member of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, their crime lab.
Mm-hmm. Neat. Any questions from the attendees?
No questions yet, but a lot of shout outs. Andrew Mossberg says, hi, Lily and Laura. And Mary Kime is here, and she says, I very much enjoyed watching Dr. Anderson showing the herbarium. With each plant, he had great info on how to ID and field info. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And then Ann Redmond says hi. And,
Hi, Ann.
And Greg Thomas, one of your former students, says hello, and it's great to see you again.
What's that?
Greg Thomas, one of
the
former students.
Student from a few years back. They're getting further back, aren't they, Greg? If I'm slow at responding, I've got some new hearing aids, and one of them went bad yesterday, so I got to go see the audiologist. So I'm chugging along with one hearing aid, so I may not hear your question, but Lily will
translate.
Run interference.
Greg does have a question, actually. He says he would like you to talk more about red oaks and white oaks, specifically how to differentiate between them.
It's interesting, as you probably well aware, that whiskey and other liquors are aged in barrels of white oak. And because the structure of these cells protruding through the pits into the vessel becomes blocked. Those protrusions are called tyloses. And so that makes the wood of white oak pretty waterproof, whereas red oak has very large vessels and a ring porous wood. So if you made a barrel of red oak and put a fluid in it, you'd get some loss, some evaporation. But in white oak, it's minimal because of those tyloses. So white oak is the preferred storage to age the liquor. So that's.
So what about differentiating the two in the field?
Oh, in the field, okay. The white oaks tend to have smooth or rounded leaf margins. If you're aware of Nature Conservancy, their logo is a white oak leaf, whereas the red oaks, the lobes of the leaves are often very pointed with a little bristle sticking out there, like our southern red oak, Quercus falcata. The red oaks have pointy leaves. There's a few oaks that haven't read our textbooks and they're a little bit sneaky, but basically that's the way to tell them apart, is whether the leaf margin is smooth or rounded or if it's bristly tipped.
And we have a question. Which one do you prefer?
Which one do you prefer?
Of what, the oaks? And that's make any difference to me.
Do you have any favorite plants?
Oh, whatever I'm working on at the time. For decades, the sunflower family, the Asteraceae, asters, daisies, goldenrods, thistles, dandelions, all those are in the sunflower family. That's been my family with a lot of focus, but occasionally I'll just run into something that is interestingly enough that it's like needs to be named for science, and it's in some other groups. So I've studied Xyrus, the yellow-eyed grass. I've studied Paranacea, the little nail wort or whitlow wort. You have to be a botanist to love those. The flowers are 1 to 2 millimeters long, but it's interesting with the whitlow wort. It occurs Paranacea minima. It occurs only in Washington County and northern Bay County. Yet down in the Lake Wells Ridge area, there's Paranacea chartacea, and pressed specimens, they look very, very similar. In fact, one of the authorities of the group told me when I was studying them, they probably weren't even distinct. I wanted to list minima as a separate species, but on his advice, I called it a subspecies of chartacea. But then some researchers in the past couple of years have studied them biochemically and otherwise, and they agreed with me that the two are distinct. They're separated by many, many miles, but they're also distinct species. So we have Paranacea chartacea, an endangered species in the Lake Wells Ridge area, and Paranacea minima, an endangered species in the karst pond area of southern Washington County and adjacent Bay County. So when I first discovered that, it just looked like a yellowish green. I thought it might be algae along the sandy margin of these ponds. And when I looked closely, I saw that, hey, there are stems and leaves there, and discovered the flowers were super, super small, but turns to be a very interesting biological system because the plant is either male or female, or rarely the two species, the two sexes will be on the same plant, but basically they're male or female. The male plant is more widely branched. When I say widely branched, the whole plant's just a few inches across in diameter, but the female plant is tighter and more of a pincushion. And so if you think of pollination, widely branched system allows pollen to be removed by wind or by insects, and a tight little system is a good catcher for pollen. So there was a sexual dimorphism in the plants, even as small as the flowers were. And the researchers that published on it just in the last year or two. They were really intrigued with this. That's what they studied in greater detail. So whatever is catches my eye is my favorite plant at the moment. Since retirement, where I don't have to worry about lesson plans and committee work and all that, to keep active, what I've done is developed want lists or watch lists for the various counties of the panhandle of species that ought to be in a county, but they haven't been documented as far as the Florida Atlas is concerned, which the University of South Florida maintains there in Tampa. So I have these watch lists, and some of my favorite plants are those that I go hunting for. And each year I add hundreds of new county reports. Of course, that will be diminishing returns, but it takes them off the want list. But for the past several years, I've averaged well over 400 new first reports for a given county for a given species in the Florida Panhandle. So with current gasoline prices, it's cutting into my pro bono work a little bit, because Leon County is the best studied county in the state. It has over 1,600 species documented, much higher than Hillsborough with University of South Florida, or Alachua with University of Florida, or Miami-Dade with the universities down there. So that sort of tells you that I have to go a little bit further afield to find things. So I go over to Lafayette County around Mayo, or over to Holmes County west of Bonifay frequently. Those are the two counties that have been more helpful in finding new things lately. But I still get out as often as I can, once or twice a week, and explore a given county to see what's blooming and to see if the species is on the watch list or not. Of course, the watch list isn't perfect. It's just things I thought ought to be there, but haven't been documented. But occasionally I run across something that I didn't have on the list that wasn't documented. And so that becomes interesting. And just the last year, I've added a few new things that they're exotics, but they've never been reported for the entire state of Florida before. So it's always an adventure to get out in the woods, and very satisfying adventure, because you realize the awesome diversity that's there in nature.
Any other questions, or should I ask them?
We do. So Greg Farm from Martin County chapter, obviously I posted in the description, you were on the Rare Plant Council, right?
Yeah.
So he asks, the comp plans in some cities and counties in Southeast Florida require protection of federally and state listed plants. How can these protections be added to state regulations?
Well, I've sat on the state's Florida Endangered Plant Advisory Council for over 35 years. And if we determine that a species is sufficiently rare in the state, first of all, it's got to be native. We don't list things that have come in as exotics that might actually be future weeds, but we don't even consider them. But a native species, which is in itself a challenge. Some people identify a native species as one that was here before Columbus, but no one was here to make a good documentation of that event. So we don't know, in one sense, what is native. But the committee, which involves university professors, representative of native nurseries, representative of flower garden clubs, representative of the lumber industry, a wide variety that are on the committee, and we determine whether a species should be listed as endangered or threatened. When I joined the group, they just sort of had one person be an advocate saying, yeah, this ought to be listed, and so they'd list it, and I thought there ought to be a better defensible way. So I came up with set of questions that is now standardly used. One is how many, an estimate of how many individual plants there are. And of course, that's an estimate, but then another, and a very low number would receive a 1, a high number would receive a 5. And then the number of counties in which it is found, again, from 1 to 5. And then on a negative aspect, the number of populations that are protected in state properties or parks, or they're actually given some protection. So there's a series of questions that are asked, and then the numerical, if the number comes up 9 or less, it's endangered, and if it's 9 to 15 or so, it's threatened. We don't actively consider threatened species that much. So we have many more listed as endangered, over 400, and only 100 or 2 listed as threatened, because it's really the endangered species that we're focusing on. And most of the threatened species get in that category because we found out that they were more abundant than we thought. But if we really went after threatened species, that number would be higher than the endangered species. So if any part of the state has a population of a species that they figure is worthy of considering as being endangered, they should submit their information to one of the committee members, and the secretary of the committee is in the Bureau of Plant Industry at Department of Agriculture there in Gainesville. And so we meet annually and consider possible new listings. And then we also review every 4 or 5 years plants that have been identified as endangered to see if they still are. If we found more information about them, more populations, sometimes we downgrade from endangered to threatened because we found more populations of them. But we at least have a numerical, logical way of determining if something's endangered or not. Whereas before, if a person had a strong personality and a dynamic view, everybody would agree that, yeah, we should list that as endangered, but it considers the whole state. For quite a number of years, people from southern Florida kept wanting to put the saw palmetto on the endangered species list, and people in North Florida says, you got to be kidding, it's everywhere. But they were concerned about the harvesting of the berries for medicinal applications. And so there is another category which is called commercially exploited. And if a species is listed as commercially exploited, anyone that wishes to collect or harvest those species must get a permit through the Division of Plant Industry there, Department of Agriculture. But for endangered and threatened, if you want to collect them, you also have to have a permit, unless it's your own property, and then there's not much protection to the plant. But if you want to develop your property or anything like that, then you've got to consider that these species are theirs. So the most protected species in the state probably is sea oats, not because of its rarity, because of its very important ecological value in stabilizing dunes along the coast. So the sea oats has its own legislative prohibition for collecting it. So if you collect sea oats, you could be in danger because the dried flower stalks make nice arrangements. But if you go out and collect many of them, you might be fined.
So on privately owned property, even federally endangered or state endangered plants have no real protections, correct?
Well, not to the owner, but
Yeah.
but if you want to go in and
Harvest them,
then
or-
you've got to get a permit.
If it's your property, then you can do whatever you want.
Pretty
There's
much,
really
yeah.
no protection, unfortunately, for
Yeah.
federally or state listed endangered.
Some of the
species.
botanists lament that the regulation just makes it hard for you to do research on the plants. but it's well intended to protect these plants. Of course, the disturbing overall overriding aspect is with global warming, the endangered species are the most vulnerable for climate change. And so we're protecting and trying to preserve species that may not last anyway, but that doesn't mean we should give up trying. We should try to protect the diversity, because you never know what's in that diversity. Some of those plants may have very important chemicals that would have medicinal value or whatever after they're researched in the future. So we need to protect them as best we can, but certainly the endangered species are the most vulnerable to climate change.
So what protections does the state listing afford them?
Well,
And what enforcement is there of that?
well, they actually have inspectors that will check in nurseries to see where they got their material, and to check people that are exiting from state forests or various properties to see what they have. So they actually have an enforcement wing, but the protection is a more ethical protection than real protection. But there is some bite in it. They have levied fines before for people that are harvesting illegally.
Yeah, they seem to be pretty tough on the saw palmetto harvesting in South Florida.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't really hear of much enforcement in North Florida of any
Right,
kind
yeah.
of listed species,
Well,
besides animals.
I mean, that's a fact of life, I guess. South Florida has the largest budget. The state's divided into about 7 water management districts, and they do have a lot to control the environmental operations, but that's on a tax base. So South Florida, which we might say is the most beat up
Ecologically.
has the highest budget to try and restore what they have. And Northwest Florida, which has the best ecosystems still around, has the smallest budget because we're a smaller population base from which the budget is taxed. So we have a smaller budget to try and preserve the better part of the state as far as the ecological health of the systems.
Yes, so I think, Greg's point is that, there are some counties that are in Southeast Florida that are enacting stronger regulations than state regulations that actually say you cannot actually hurt this plant in any way, which is not what our state regulations say.
Yeah.
And so
Even if it's on somebody's privately owned property?
he did not describe exactly.
Okay.
Well, the nice thing is if you have the county behind you, they can control the roadside mowing in their county. We have some counties that just buck up against any suggestion that they should modify their mowing because they have a strong lobby from the mowers, because the more often they mow, the more money they make. But some counties are very sensitive to the value of nice roadsides as far as tourism is concerned. For example, ecotourism is one thing that might help save the flora. And so in some counties, they're very sensitive to when they mow, so they won't reduce the floral display or damage the reproductive structures. And sometimes a delayed mowing is actually beneficial because as the mower goes down the roadside, it spreads the seeds, the propagules along the roadside. So we've actually had some endangered species seem to increase a little bit in range because of roadside mowing. But if it's done at the wrong season, of course, it wipes out a year's reproduction.
I've been surprised at how, speaking of endangered plants on roadsides, Harper Callus, which is a plant you've studied, Harper Callus flava, which is endemic to a few counties in the Florida panhandle.
Right.
It's also called Harper's Beauty. It it almost exclusively occurs along roadsides, and it's fairly prolific in many areas along the roadside, even though it's an extremely rare species.
Yeah.
And it's really persisting probably because of the continual
Yeah.
disturbance of mowing on the roadsides.
Yeah, Harper's Beauty was discovered by an FSU graduate student, and it was named, they had to name a genus for it as well because it was so distinctive. So Harper Callus flava was named in 1961, and it was known from just a few localities very close to Highway 65, Route 65. And then when the lobby got strong enough where they modified the mowing a little bit and waited later in the season to mow, then they were mowing mature capsules. And so the population did expand along the road some. But luckily, a National Forest botanist named Louise Kern decided that there's got to be populations somewhere else. And she discovered that the ecotone, the transition between an upland longleaf pine slope and a cypress stringer, that area where the moisture gradient was just correct and there was a bit of an opening because of the change in the system, was the ideal spot for it. And so we found several populations now in the National Forest that are away from the main roads, which is nice to know. But I think I talked about this before, but it was fascinating when I was giving a talk once. I showed a slide of 2 close-up flower heads, and I noticed that one of them had 5 stigmas instead of 3 stigmas. Well, lilies are supposed to have 6 stamens and 3 carpels, or 3 units of the ovary. And I thought, what's it got 5 for? So I went back out to the highway and found out the majority of the populations, or I studied 2 populations, one just south of Wilma and one just north of Sumatra. And in those 2 populations, 4, 5, and 6 carpels were collectively more abundant than the 3 carpellate, which is supposed to be the true form. And I studied it for several years, and one year was an extra wet year, one area was pretty dry, one was hot, one was cooler. So I took out those environmental aspects, and I thought the potential driving force might be leaded gas, because it's right along the highway, and leaded gas stopped doing it in the 1990s, I think, taking lead out of the gas. And in recent years, the extracarpellate flowers are not nearly as frequently seen. And all the populations that were seen away from the highway had just the 3 standard carpels like they're supposed to have. So maybe that Route 65 corridor was damaged by leaded gas or some other factor that caused the ovaries to proliferate in an unusual way. That's an interesting thing, because it is one of the 2 original endangered species that were listed in the 1973 Endangered Species Act. The other one was Chapman's rhododendron. So Chapman's rhododendron and Harper's Beauty were the 2 species that were listed in the Federal Endangered Species Act, the original act.
Those are the only 2 plant species? That couldn't be you mean the only 2 in Florida?
No, the 2 that were mentioned from Florida in the original act. And then since then, of course.
Then Terreo was added in 84.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that those were the 2 first added from Florida. But Chapman's rhododendron is even less common.
Well, there's a technical problem there. Is it a true separate species, or just a variety of rhododendron minus, which occurs up in Alabama and Georgia? If you look at one sample of each, they look pretty distinctive. But if you look at enough samples, maybe there's a gradation there that maybe varietal status is its best status, but it's losing out because of habitat alteration. Sadly, too many people in the state feel that wildflowers, since they're wild, you don't need to do anything with them. Just throw out some seed and forget about them and they'll be beautiful. The city of Apalachicola years ago got a grant from the government to cover a open garbage dump and make it a park. And so they named it Chapman Park and planted over 30 shrubs of Chapman rhododendron they got from a nursery. And being native, they just put them in and left them. And a year later, there were 2 still alive out of the 36 they planted. They asked me to help survey what was there and make recommendations, but they didn't follow any recommendations about you got to water them for at least 2 years to let them get established. But wildflowers can withstand drought better than a lot of our ornamental horticultural plants, but to get them established, they've got to need a little help sometimes, especially if you put them in an environment where they weren't originally found.
Yeah. And especially if you've transplanted them from a pot to the ground.
Exactly.
If you grew them from seed and they,
right.
started there, then you don't have to water
transplants,
as much,
you often
gotta
damage
water a
the
lot.
root system a little bit. And if you don't help them out with water, they're going to not thrive very well at all.
Any other questions or? All right.
We have Greg Thomas from Heartland, former student, asks, does it seem likely that climate change could have an impact on Florida's floristic species diversity?
Oh, I think we can answer that quickly, but Greg Thomas asked does it seem like climate change will have a drastic impact on the floristic diversity of Florida?
Well, I think that is a given.
Yeah, definitely.
When I first came to Florida, skunk vine, for example, was just central southern Florida, but now we're seeing skunk vine a lot through North Florida because the temperatures are being less
warmer,
severe, especially the winter temperatures don't get cold enough. And so a lot of southern things that get north are staying there, and it won't see it in my lifetime necessarily, but in most of you guys' lifetime, you'll see a big shift in the floristic composition. Some plants are being challenged because one of the interesting things, I use the wrong adjective sometimes, it's not interesting, but it is a fact that flowers that bloom earlier than they used to may not have their pollinators. If the pollinators are migratory, they may not have their pollinators available if they bloom earlier. And so reproduction, seed set, pollination, successful production of fruit may not occur as frequently as the temperatures get warmer and warmer, because unless the insects or what other pollinators, hummingbirds or whatever, unless they adjust also to the different calendar system, then the plants aren't going to get pollinated as frequently.
And one of the real issues too is that it's not like it's a gradual shift in one direction of just warming climate. We're getting more and more erratic, strange, and drastic shifts in climate, like sudden very hot spells in winter and then sudden very cool spells in spring. That if it were more reliably consistent, it might give the plants a chance to adapt over time, but especially with the erratic nature of climate change, the way it's happening, it is going to have a drastic impact. It is having a drastic impact.
It's just not in temperatures, but precipitation. Tallahassee area gets a little over 60 inches a year average, but it can come in 2 or 3 major storms, the bulk of it. And that's not the best for the plant. If it got a measured amount throughout the year, it's going to be a lot happier plant than if it gets flooded twice a year. But on paper, you look at the average for the year and it looks, the same as the other year. But the intensity and droughtiness between those heavy rain events is not good for the plant either. So variation in climate, as well as the warming of the climate, the variability is more extreme now.
And just the loss of the coastlines. The coastlines are going to be moving inland, and there are a lot of species that occur only at the coast.
Yeah.
And they won't necessarily be moving as quickly.
Yeah, when I back in the 1980s, I did an intensive study of Dog Island in Franklin County, figuring that was an interesting island because there's no bridge to it. So if the plants get there, they aren't because they got a piggyback ride in a truck or a car, that they got there by the wind. And so I was interested in studying what got to Dog Island, what didn't, compared to the mainland. And in the 1980s, I occasionally would see red mangrove propagules washed up on the sand, and I actually stuck a couple of them upright into the sand to see what happened. They did not survive. Now there are known populations of healthy red mangrove along the
all along the
coast,
all along the Gulf Coast up here.
Yeah, so
that's going to change the whole hydrology of the estuaries up here.
So the warming is apparent in certain species already that were more southern Florida species, and now they're up in the panhandle.
Mm-hmm. I've seen white mangrove up here too, even.
Well, white mangrove has been here for a long time. It was, in fact, it survived when we had temperatures get down into single digit back in the 1980s. The white mangrove survived on Dog Island. Trees only get, or the bushes only get 3 feet tall, but they'll bloom and set fruit. So they don't look at all like white mangrove in South Florida, but they're there and they've survived for a long time. We had a student, he was actually in oceanography, but he studied the seed proteins of white mangrove and noticed in the, he didn't identify what it all was, but noticed in various readings that the protein profile in the Dog Island white mangroves was different than it was for the more tropically oriented ones. So it had become adapted to a colder environment, but now it's warming up, so it doesn't need those extra proteins or whatever it had.
So we have another interesting question about climate change and plant movement. As some plants migrate further north, do you think there will be hybridization with related northern species?
Well, hybridization can be a very important aspect, and as southern Florida species move northward, they may hybridize with closely related species. When I was in graduate school, I was in Southern California, and an interesting phenomenon, they had some what we call gully washers, real heavy rainstorms, and up the canyon was one species of cactus, and then down around Pomona, where Claremont Graduate University is another species of cactus. And these gully washers washed cactus pads down into the valley, and the two hybridized, where they had been separate for centuries, possibly elevationally separate, but then these storms moved the one down and they did hybridize. So if you get unusual rapid movement of a species into an area where related species occur, you have the possibility of hybridization, which may storm, the genetic variability of the two might be compromised.
Yeah.
We have sort of an unrelated question about native turfgrass replacements. So this is the same, Diane. She asked.
Native turfgrass replacements. Yeah. So what's her question?
Specifically, her question is, do you think that Dicanthelium commutatum, variable witchgrass, would make a good turfgrass substitute?
Dicanthelium commutatum, do you think that would be a good turf grass substitute?
I doubt it,
Doesn't it
because
get fairly tall?
well, when it blooms, it's, a foot taller, and it doesn't form a huge rosette. It's mostly stem and leaf stem, and so that wouldn't make a very good.
But there are other
Turf grass.
dicanthelium.
Yeah, there's a few dicantheliums that have a very dense rosette, and they may do well, but many of the dicantheliums are annuals, so that isn't so great for turf grass unless you manage it so that they reseed. I'm the wrong one to talk about turf grass. My lawn must have about 8 species of grass in it, plus a dozen dicots. And not all those species of grass are desirable, but I don't work with my lawn much. I'm always out in the woods looking at the native stuff. But there are some areas where if you have shade and sufficient moisture, St. Augustine makes a very nice lawn. But it's
And that St. Augustine sod is a native species.
yeah, and it's more
robust,
larger leaved, but like a Bermuda, you can get strains of Bermuda that you can cut right down to millimeters. That's what they use for greens on golf courses, because you can have that carpet-like green that's Bermuda. You can cut it so short and it still is alive, but some grasses you can't do that. I was raised in the West, and so our lawns were always Kentucky bluegrass, which is a fantastic lawn grass, but it's slow to green up in the springtime. I had to laugh. We had the department chairman at Kansas State University is when we still had a botany department rather than an amalgamation into a biology department. The department chairman sprayed his lawn green every winter so that the Bermuda was green all year round, because he sprayed it with a dye that was healthy or not repressive to the plants. And so he had this green lawn year round. Looked very unusual because all the rest of the lawns around him were straw colored in the wintertime.
I think there is a big opportunity for native grasses, sedges, to become, incorporated into a lawn, or at least into yards. Mm-hmm. And I think there's just gonna have to be more experimentation. And I bought a house recently, and I am in the process of renovating it, so I'm not living in it yet, but I introduced some frog fruit, Phylla nodiflora, to the lawn, and it's starting to creep into the lawn. Mm-hmm. And then I've been sprinkling all sorts of sedges and native sedge and grass seeds throughout the lawn. And I've especially been paying attention to species that I see on roadsides that get mowed and that get driven over and seem to thrive regardless. And one of those species up here is Coreopsis Lancioleta, which is a beautiful, blooming Asteraceae species, but it seems to be able to be mowed very low. And so I've collected just some on the roadside, some seeds on the roadside, and sprinkled them around. And just this past week, I was in the Apalachicola National Forest and found a few populations of Rincospora Curtissii, which is a species of Rincospora that has very fine, kind of rounded leaf blades, and they're very soft. And it was growing in fairly moist areas, so it would need to grow in a moist area in your yard, but it grew very densely and it was super soft. So I think that there's so much opportunity out there, but we really need people like us to start kind of experimenting and seeing what works, and then sharing that information with growers.
Yeah. If you have a lawn where you don't have kids playing in it a lot, with a lot of foot traffic, Dichondra, sometimes called ponyfoot, because of its sort of rounded heart-shaped leaf. There are varieties of it that are used in Southern California for lawn because it only gets a certain height. You never need to mow it. It's just there, but it does not accept foot traffic very happily. Speaking of lawns, I'm amused, reminding myself of down around Port St. Joe. I was driving down once and there was a rather extensive, several acres of golden yellow. And we have 3 different genera, which we call golden asters, Coreopsis, Pityopsis, and Heterotheca. Well, Heterotheca subaxillaris can be 3 or 4 feet tall, but it does very, very well in dry, sandy habitats. And they had mowed the lawn along the highway there so that closely that the Heterotheca had branched out a lot. It was very stubby. It wouldn't be a very good lawn to play in because the bases of those stems are a little bit twiggy. But there was a whole lawn of golden yellow aster heads, just 1 or 2 inches off the ground because it had reacted to the mowing. Of course, with a lot of plants, you top it, and then the lateral buds are activated hormonally, and you get a branching pattern. So plants that usually aren't very branchy can be very bushy if you top them. And so here was this golden aster forming a lawn down by Port St. Joe, and I've been there several different years, and it persists. It's a pretty good lawn.
Speaking of, you mentioned Pityopsis, and I think Pityopsis is a really great, it's slower growing than a typical sod would be, but it's a really great choice for a sod substitute because it does grow very densely. It has leaf blades that form very dense thickets, and it spreads by underground runners. And then it can be mowed and walked on, and it is extremely tough, and it's really lovely too. And it blooms in the fall. It's just a little bit slower at spreading. The Pityopsis tracei is the more common one up here. And then what's I'm blanking on the name of the chalky blue stem like plant that's not the grass that's not Andropogon. It's Schizachyrium. That it grows very densely as well and forms dense patches, although it's not as low growing as the Pityopsis is. What were you saying?
I was gesturing that it's kind of big.
Yeah, it gets taller.
Yes.
Right.
But if I think that people need to just consider diversifying their lawn. Like another thing that I planted my lawn is Zephyranthes Adamasco. So, it gets mowed on roadsides, and, you might not have a whole lawn of just Zephyranthes or just Coreopsis Lancioleta or just frog fruit. But if you have an intermingling of all of those species, it looks mostly green year round. And that's what I'm going for, is I'm trying to kind of recreate the roadsides that I see that get mowed that look green during the year and look nice. And then they bloom at certain times of year.
Yeah, there's a lot of plants, if you just leave them alone, they do well. The Hebranthus robustus, which used to be put in Zephyranthes, it's a pink flowered zephyr lily, but Hebranthus, when I moved in 1974, right by my driveway, there was a small clump of it, and I just ignored it. It dies back midsummer, but then in the spring, it's got this beautiful lily-like pink bloom, and it has spread since I've not bothered it. It has spread 4 or 5 times the area it originally had, and there's no telling what you can have if you experiment. Sometimes you do it inadvertently. I sometimes bring plants home that I didn't press in the field, so I pressed them in the back of the car in the driveway, and Myosotis macrosperma, a large-seeded forget-me-not. It's got a pale bluish white flower and sticky seeds that stick to your socks. I've got a good population along the side of the driveway now, that where a few were left over when I pressed them. And each year the population is larger.
One Carex species that I'm planting that I'm excited to see how it does is Carex daisy carpa. It's a really beautiful, pretty low growing species of Carex, and it occurs in shaded kind of woodland areas.
Mhm.
And I've seen areas where it gets so dense it looks like a lawn, and it looks really lovely. So I'm planting some seeds of that to see how they do.
Claire is asking, did you say Pideopsis graminifolia?
I said Pideopsis tracii, which is what I think most people, you can explain.
It's sometimes considered a variety
Yeah.
of graminifolia. Graminifolia has Semple is the authority. He's up in Toronto, I believe, but he's in Canadian. But he was the authority on the Pideopsis, and he named several varieties of graminifolia. But it's interesting, again, with species, Pideopsis graminifolia has glandular hairs on the bracts right around the head, which we call the filaries or the involucre. And if they come down the stem, then it's Pideopsis aspera. And if it gets onto the leaves, it's Pideopsis aspera variety adenolepis. And it's basically a continuum, where they've got three different names for the continuum. But in Pideopsis graminifolia, you have some very broad-leaved ones like latidens and tracii, and some very narrow-leaved ones. But it's interesting complex.
And there are different species that grow in, just like Carex is so diverse. I mean, well, Pideopsis is not quite as diverse, but there are species that grow in wet areas too.
Yeah.
We have Pideopsis elegantha, which is really lovely, a really lovely species. That
It's the first thing to bloom after a fire in the national forest. Pideopsis elegantha will bloom. It blooms earlier in the year than the other Pideopsis do. And then along some of our roadsides, it's very local species, but there's concern about the enlargement of the road from Tallahassee to Crawfordville, because that's sort of ground zero for Pideopsis flexuosa, which is considered an endangered species. It only occurs in 4 or 5 counties in the Florida Panhandle, but it is in the national forest and some other protected areas. But some of its thickest populations are right along the highway from Tallahassee to Crawfordville. But when they widen the road, they always disturb the roadside further. So there'll be areas for it to seed into, and it'll probably persist in future.
Yeah, so we've been doing, FNPS has been doing a plant rescue of Pideopsis flexuosa along the roadside near the airport out here in Tallahassee, because they're going to be widening the road. And so I've been working on that. And one plant, since they're going to be destroying all of these plants, we're specifically focusing on the Pideopsis in order for transplant to a recipient site in Lake Talquin State Forest. But I've been digging other things and putting them in my yard because, we're going to lose these plants anyway. So there's, I can't remember the species of Astragalus. There are only 2.
Well, there's Villosus and Obcordatus.
Obcordatus. There's Astragalus obcordatus out there.
Yeah.
And so I dug a few of those and planted them in my yard, and they're coming along. They're alive still. So we'll see how those do, because those are also low growing perennial Fabaceae pea family members. So that'll be interesting to see how they do.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes, Greg, very engaged tonight. He asks, I'm curious why the white top sedge, which is formerly called Dichromina, has been moved into Rincospora genus.
Well, there's 2 ways to view a group. One is locally and one is globally. And if you look at Rincospora globally, you find that there other species of Rincospora that have white bracts. And so the dichromina, which is two colors, really identifies colorata and latifolia. And then on southern Florida, there's Floridanus. We got three that were in the old traditional grouping dichromina, but there's, for example, Rincospora macra, which definitely looks like a standard Rincospora, except that the filaries, they're not as white or as broad as they are in your star grasses, but they're white. And so we have situations where if you look at things globally, you have a different view than if you just look at things locally. Frequently, two genera that we've always considered separate get merged and look at them worldwide. For example, in the barberry family, you have Berberis, the barberry, and you have Mahonia, the Oregon grape. And in their extremes, they look so different, but on a worldwide basis, probably one genus. And there are several cases like that. If you look at them on a worldwide basis, we had the little, I should say, little shrubby or tree plant that has either rusty or silvery underleaf. And we call them gum bullies. Used to be the genus Bumelia, but Sideroxylon is a worldwide genus. And for a while, they said old world stuff is Sideroxylon and new world stuff is Bumelia. But then they found Sideroxylon-like plants in Mexico and Bumelia-like plants in Siberia. And on the worldwide scale, they were merged as one genus, Sideroxylon. So the pond cypress are super distinct, but in the big cypress swamp down by Naples, it's hard to tell them apart sometimes. So some consider one just a variety of the other, and others, depending on where they live, I guess, say, oh, they're definitely distinct.
There are some up here, I feel like, that they look like bald cypress growing among pond cypress.
Yeah.
You know, so they're just, that's the thing is there's just, we're trying to pin down, a moving, living,
Yeah, we put our labels and our definitions on plants that are illiterate. They don't they don't read our books, and they aren't very concerned about political boundaries either, so we get really excited if we got something in Florida that had been known only from Georgia. But as far as the plant's concerned, it's just that the habitat was suitable, so I'm growing here. And sometimes they surprise us.
Any other questions?
I think that's it
Oh,
for questions. Yeah. I just wanted to put in a quick plug for Sunshine Mimosa. I mean, I know it's not ideal because it does tend to die back in the winter, but man, it doesn't get better than those little pink puffballs.
Mimosa striculosa.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a good
ground cover. There are some areas where it is, if it's not an area you're going to be walking on a lot, you wouldn't have to mow, and you have these little beautiful pink pom-poms all over the place. But Mimosa striculosa is a very good ground cover if you get it well established.
Yeah, it's not evergreen up here. I don't know if it's evergreen in the peninsula, but up here it definitely loses, it looks dead in the winter, which is not great. But again, if you intermix it with a lot of other native species that would be, green in the winter, it's nice. And it is also a very aggressive species, I would say, is like, it's definitely difficult to maintain. But it's wonderful for erosion control. I used it in a house I was living in that had a big steep slope, and I was trying to plant stuff along the slope, and it just, kept eroding. And the sunshine mimosa really held that. I planted it in there, and it really held the soil together, and then I could interplant within the sunshine mimosa.
Another interesting aspect of botany is that we sometimes confuse common names with scientific names, and Albizia julibrisson is often given the common name as mimosa. And when I taught field botany, I required the students to turn in pressed specimens as part of their grade. And some of them would look in the index mimosa and go write down Mimosa strigulosa for a beautiful example of Albizia. I said, did you key this out? You're talking about trees versus herbs here. And it's really crazy. For example, the very common shrub in everywhere except Florida, in the northeastern and western states where it's cooler, the lilac, which there are several species in Europe, it's a very popular fragrant flowered shrub, but the generic name of the lilac is syringa. And syringa is the common name of the mock orange in Idaho. I was born and raised in Idaho, and the syringa was our state flower, which was Philadelphus lewisii, because Lewis and Clark discovered a mock orange as they crossed what would become Idaho in 1803, 1804. And so syringa is the common name of the mock orange in Idaho, yet it's the generic name of the lilac. And common names and scientific names don't always match.
Yep. I find myself relying a little bit more on common names as I've seen scientific names change, simply for understanding. Because I've been into like scientific names for a long time, but then they change up, and you have to say, oh, you say this the new scientific name, and then you have to go back and say the common name.
Well, it's interesting. Sometimes we have regulations made by politicians rather than by biologists. And so if a species is to be listed as endangered or threatened, it has to have a common name as well as a scientific name. And so sometimes that common name doesn't exist. So when we decided that Lepuropetalon spatulatum was endangered, the whole plant can almost fit under a pencil eraser. One of the Endangered Plant Advisory Council members says, oh, we'll call it Little People. And that's the name that's stuck. And sometimes the common name is so erroneous because sometimes you just take the Latin name or scientific name and interpret it. For example, we have a euphorbia that is in the horticultural trade because it's very beautiful in hanging baskets because the stems are very limp and they hang down and they have the white cyathea and such. But this plant scientific name is Euphorbia graminea. So the common name is grass-leaved spurge. Well, the leaves are ovate or rhombic. I went back to the literature when I first found it growing wild in Florida and found that Joaquin in Central America found it growing in a grassy meadow. So he named it Graminea because of the habitat, not because of the characteristics of the plant at all. So grass-leaved spurge has very broad leaves. You get up near the inflorescence where the leaves shift to what we call bracts. Some of the bracts are rather narrow, but they're still not grass-like. So grass-leaved spurge is a terrible name. And just like that white-flowered Tradescantia, that's such an invasive plant, beautiful flower, Tradescantia fluminensis, it's called the short-leaved daylily, or not daylily, but it's in the daylily family. But spiderwort, short-leaved spiderwort, dayflower. But it the leaf is relatively short, but it's very, very broad, and there could be a better common name than short-leaved for it. But so common names can be misleading, and sometimes they change at the state line. A friend of mine in Kansas was a specialist on a group of shrubby members of the sunflower family, and the species name common name, and actually the scientific name changed it when he went from Kansas to Colorado. Same plant, but as soon as it was in Colorado, it had a different name. And botanists were sure that's what it was.
Nice.
Well, lots of people saying thank you in the chat. It seemed like it was really well received discussion.
Great, good.
So,
And if you guys, if people want to suggest topics, if you have like specific areas of interest that you think that you'd like to hear Dr. Anderson pontificate upon, let us know, and we could have another little get together and talk about, you know, something specific. So yeah.
Good.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys.